Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my final AM reading for August 2022. I'm definitely coming to this a little later than I hoped to, since it is now September. But I mentioned in my last video that my cat had a specialty appointment, a specialist appointment on Monday because she's been sick, and to be more specific about it, she has cancer, and I had an appointment with the oncologist, and the prognosis was very dire, and I've elected to put her in hospice care. So it's been a very emotional week for me. Missy is only 7 years old, although I imagine, it's difficult to lose a cat or an animal at any age. Although she is my second cat that I'm losing in middle age. In fact, she's younger than Leia was when she died. My cat Leia was 10 when I started my booktube channel. She was famously in the back of my videos. So anyway, I'm coming to terms with a lot right now, but for the time being, I'm going to continue, reading and writing and all that good stuff, but, giving myself some leeway, hopefully, if I need to step away from booktube or whatever for a while. But for now, I feel like it actually is a nice distraction in a way, so that I don't just hover over Missy every second of every day. Unfortunately, I was able to join my hospital had a hospice program, which is really quite nice, and it's a way to not be alone in this. And I'm talking with nurses, and I have a vet coming to visit, like an in-home appointment on Friday, so it's so nice not to be alone in this. So anyway, I figured I'd just do a brief recap of the books and such that I have finished as August has come to a close. As usual, I'll start with the short story I read in this collection by Dorothy Parker. I have been reading one Dorothy Parker short story per AM reading video since last May in 2021. This week I've read I Live on Your Visits, which she published in 1955. It's a little bit of a jump forward in time, and it's interesting to think of this character too, this woman who has a lot of the snark and I guess passive aggressiveness of a lot of the younger women of her other stories, but she's of a different age and has different relationships, so I guess in a way we're watching Parker grow herself. I mean, so the story takes part, she's living in this hotel, and her teenage son comes to visit her. This woman is divorced and bitter, and just as passive aggressively, pillaring her son for not being interested enough in her. And there's all sorts of other kind of hilarity going on, I guess, on the, or absurdity maybe, going on the sidelines. Like, she has a special friend she wants her son Christopher to meet, who's really her psychic, I guess it is. And she spends her time sort of giving acid, predictions to Chris, like that maybe he'll have 3 children, but one of them might be dead or something like that. And meanwhile, the mother is just being passive-aggressive or moaning about how, she doesn't have enough food to share with him, so of course he's going to go to his father, and his father's, horrible wife with the dog's name or something, but when Chris opens the fridge, he sees, like, a lot of elaborate food. He's an interesting character, I guess. In a way, I guess he's supposed to be the main character, but I don't know. I guess he's supposed to also be this surly teenager or something, but he's dealing with a lot, I suppose, with this parent. But I guess mostly what I was taken with, as always, is the humor in all of this passive aggressiveness, and how Parker's characters handle being in situations where they don't want to be, or where they decide not to go with social grace or that sort of thing. So yeah, I enjoyed it. I mean, I guess I was a little, I'm not sure I got as much as I hoped to out of it, because I've been distracted, and I actually listened to Andrew Sean Greer read and discussed his thoughts on the story on a New Yorker podcast, which was interesting. I think he focused on some slightly different things, and I will link that down below. The first book I finished since my last AM reading video is The Sound of Our Steps by Ronit Matalon, which I read for Women in Translation Month, so it was translated by Dalia Biddu. And in fact, I discussed it a little bit, hopefully in my Women in Translation video, which I made a few days ago. I'll link below. Suffice to say, this story is semi-autobiographical, takes place in some slums outside of Tel Aviv, mostly in mid-20th century. We're following the main character is largely unnamed young girl child, and she's living in this shack with her mother, who's like this force of nature, and you know, famously as a Mizrahi Jew of Middle Eastern descent immigrant, she kind of went from being a starlet in Egypt to really being a nobody in Israel, and largely is economically deprived and also culturally deprived. Like, one of the major things is that the Ashkenazi or European descended people, like, you know, are insistent that they should, you know, change her name from her French name to a Hebrew name and all that sort of stuff. And anyway, we're also dealing with the young child's two older siblings and her largely absent father, who is sort of this political railer against the system. And she also lives with a grandparent. So yeah, and we're getting her in these vignettes, largely in the house, like dealing very closely with like what it's like to these formative experiences and what it's like to grow up there. And they're largely disconnected. It's rather easy to forget them, you know, vignette by vignette. I found, even though they're well written, it's just very disconnected. But there's a lot of compellingness, I suppose, especially with the father, who has his fiery ideals, although for the most part I'd say the interesting thing about this book is that even though there are some politics on the sidelines, sort of the national or religious identity isn't as central, I think, as it is in a lot of the other Israeli fiction I've read. So that's interesting too. So I think for people who, you know, lean hard into the thematic and strong writing of literary fiction, perhaps over plot and character, would like this a bit more. The next thing I finished is Wind Daughter by Joanna Ruth Meyer, which is interesting to compare and contrast. I guess kind of like the last book, I'm a little disappointed. I feel like there were some beautiful conceits to fantasy. I love that in her books. She writes YA fantasy that are chock full of fantastical elements, which is really cool. Like, here we are in a secondary world where there's magic that you can weave together, and it's controlled by the winds, and it's controlled by this creator called the Weaver, and there's, you know, this bad person, or mostly from her first book, Echo North, called the Wolf Queen, who's kind of sort of in this book as well. And so just magic, 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 like fantastical elements. It is not, you know, slight on the fantasy. But I felt like it was pretty slight on compelling characters and plot. It's a fairy tale sort of construct. It's a companion novel to Echo North, which was her fairy tale retelling. And this takes like some minor characters from that and gives them a story. But I felt like it was kind of too paint by the numbers, I suppose, for me. It just felt like I wasn't intrigued by the characters. They didn't have a lot of depth to me. Future Rachel here, as the sun is coming a little bit more through the window. And anyway, I thought I should tell you more about what this book is actually about, a bit of a summary. It takes place in a secondary fantasy world where the protagonist is a young girl named Satu. Her name means story, and she loves stories and kind of wants to see herself as worthy of her own story. She comes from a rather storied legacy, as it were, that her father used to be the North Wind and gave up his power to the Wolf Queen in order to become immortal, marry his mortal wife, and have a family. They were sort of taken out of time at that point, and were part of the Echo North story. But in this one, the Wolf Queen has been defeated, so that means the magic of the North Wind is now running rampant and is unraveling the world, starting with Satu's parents. And so Satu, who is someone who is a very hypersensitive person, has a lot of, sort of feels a lot of empathy for those around her, and like has, I guess, trouble putting herself out there in the world because of how hypersensitive she is, has to take on the mantle of trying to find her father's magic and stitch the world together. Meanwhile, she's pursued by the North Wind, who is a character who used to be sort of a lieutenant of the Wolf Queen. And she also has a ghostly companion named Fan, and she runs into other people along her journeys to find this magic, people from her mother's family and from Echo North. And it's all about her, you know, realizing her own potential and her true friends and, you know, claiming her power and her story, as you do in a YA fantasy novel. But in a way, strangely, it was kind of exactly what I needed at the time. Like, I was reading it while I was dealing with Missy's prognosis, and I didn't want to necessarily delve deep into complex characters or language, like, you know, the last book. I kind of liked the fact that I could kind of be animated by the plot, which was, you know, kind of fun, but not have to think much deeper than that. So in a way, you know, it shows how those sorts of books also serve a purpose. But in general, I feel kind of bad. But I also know that this is not quite my style. Meyer writes other books that are less fairy tale-esque and sort of more traditional fantasy in a way, with much deeper world building and more interesting characters, I think. So I hope she'll write some of those again too. I've been reading all her books. This is her 5th that she's published in so many years. I've been following her career since we were in a NaNoWriMo Vidler community together, long before she even got an agent. So it's fun in that way too to track her, and it's nice to see how, you know, she's finding success. But this book in particular, I feel like, in a way, it was right for me in this time and place. But if I step back and think of the story and the characters, I'm not quite as impressed. And finally, I'll point to this book that I finished. This is A Little Devil in America by Hanif Abdurraquib, which I read for the BookTube Prize. So all I will tell you here is that it is a book of essays largely about Black performance in America, and he uses that term very widely. So if you read this, expect to read about everything from singing and dancing and to boxing and other sorts of posturing, but I will cut myself off there. Because as an official judge of the BookTube Prize, I have to keep my lips sealed on this one until Robert is ready to announce the winners of the whole shebang in October. So anyway, the BookTube Prize was started by Robert at Barter Hordes in 2019. The point of the prize is to judge the best in literary fiction, nonfiction, and translated fiction published in the US the year before this one. And it begins in February with very long lists of 48 books per division, and throughout the months we have whittled them down, and now we are to 3 finals ballots with 6 books apiece on them. And so I am officially reading for nonfiction for the first time this year. And if you would like to hear some of my preliminary pre-reading thoughts about my ballot, I will link to my TBR video down below, as well as more information about the BookTube Prize. So that about covers it for me now. I'm also kind of sort of in the middle of these 2 books as the final 2 books that I started in August, and am including thus as part of my August TBR, and I'm thinking I might go ahead and try to do an AM reading video for them as well in early September. But before that, I would like to get to my August book haul video, which I will hopefully be posting very imminently since we are now in September. So stay tuned. In the meantime, I hope all of your reading and other things going on in your life are going well, or if they're not, you're being able to find some comfort or support in them, as I guess that's somewhat of a positive to my distressing situation is that I'm definitely not alone in what I'm going through. So yeah, thank you so much for listening and for watching, and I'll see you next time.